There's someone in your life right now. Maybe it's your boss. Maybe it's your partner. Maybe it's a client sitting across a table from you with their arms crossed and their mind already made up. And you know that what you're asking for is reasonable. It's fair, it makes sense, but the moment you open your mouth, something shifts. The wall goes up, the energy changes, and before you've even finished your sentence, you can already feel the word forming behind their eyes. And the worst part, you don't even know why. You weren't aggressive, you weren't demanding, you were polite, you were prepared, you made your case, and it still didn't work. So you walked away wondering what you're missing. What the people who always seem to get what they want actually know that you don't. Here's the answer, and it's going to change the way you communicate for the rest of your life. The most persuasive people on earth don't push harder. They don't argue better. They don't have a slicker pitch or a louder voice. What they have is something quieter and infinitely more powerful. They make people want to say yes. Not because they manipulated anyone, not because they pressured or cornered or tricked, but because they understand something fundamental about human psychology that most people never figure out, that every yes a person gives, they give to themselves first. Your job isn't to convince them. Your job is to make saying yes feel like their idea. That's what this audiobook is going to teach you. By the time we're done here, you're going to understand exactly why people say no, and it has almost nothing to do with your idea, your offer, or your logic. You're going to learn the specific psychological triggers that make people feel safe enough to say yes in conversations, in negotiations, in your relationships, and in your career. You're going to discover how the world's most influential communicators, from elite negotiators to the most trusted leaders in business, create agreement without ever creating resistance. You're going to walk away with a complete internal operating system for persuasion, one that doesn't require you to be pushy, manipulative, or someone you're not. And here's what makes this different from every other persuasion book you've come across. This isn't about tactics. Tactics wear off. People feel them. People resent them. This is about transformation. By the end of this audiobook, you won't just know how to persuade, you'll be the kind of person others naturally want to say yes to. That's the shift, and it starts right now. Before we go any further, if you're listening to this on YouTube, do one thing right now. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications for Mindset Audiobooks. Every week we release full-length audiobooks exactly like this one, built to rewire the way you think, communicate, and move through the world. No summaries, no fluff, the full experience completely free. Now, let's get into it. Chapter 1. Why Smart People Fail at Persuasion. Let's start with a story. In 2009, a researcher named Brendan Nyhan ran an experiment that quietly broke the hearts of rational people everywhere. He gathered a group of adults, presented them with documented facts that directly contradicted their existing beliefs, and watched what happened. You'd assume that when people are shown the truth, actual evidence, clear and undeniable, they'd update their thinking. That's how logic is supposed to work. That's what smart, reasonable people do. Except that's not what happened. When the facts challenged what people already believed, most of them didn't change their minds. They dug in deeper. The more compelling the evidence, the more resistant they became. Psychologists call it the backfire effect, and it tells us something devastating about the way most of us try to persuade. We think persuasion is about information. We think if we can just build a strong enough case, enough data, enough logic, enough well-constructed reasoning, people will come around. We prepare. We rehearse. We organize our arguments into bulletproof sequences, and then we deliver them with everything we've got. And people still say no. Not because your argument was weak, but because argument itself is often the wrong tool for the job. Here's the hard truth that most intelligent, well-meaning people never fully accept. The human mind was not designed to be convinced. It was designed to be protected. Think about that for a second. Every person you've ever tried to persuade came into that conversation with a brain whose primary function, wired deep into its ancient architecture, is to detect threat, preserve identity, and maintain the coherence of everything that person already believes about themselves and the world. When you make an argument, even a brilliant one, that brain doesn't hear logic first. It hears challenge. And the moment it registers challenge, the walls go up, the arms cross, the posture changes, and suddenly, you're not having a conversation anymore, you're managing a defensive reaction. This is why so many smart people are surprisingly bad at persuasion. Their intelligence actually works against them. They construct more sophisticated arguments, they anticipate objections, they prepare counterpoints, and in doing all of that, they unknowingly escalate the very dynamic that makes people resistant in the first place. You probably felt this yourself, maybe on the other side of the table. Someone comes at you with a really compelling case for something, and instead of feeling convinced, you feel something closer to suspicion. The more they push, the more something in you wants to push back. Not because they're wrong, maybe they're completely right, but because something about the pressure of being persuaded makes you want to protect your own sense of autonomy. That instinct has a name. Psychologists call it psychological reactance, the deep human need to feel that your choices are your own. The moment someone tries to take that feeling away from you, even with the best intentions, your mind fights back. It's not personal. It's not irrational. It's one of the most powerful and consistent forces in all of human behavior. And here's what this means for you. If your approach to persuasion triggers reactance, it doesn't matter how right you are. It doesn't matter how good your idea is. It doesn't matter how carefully you've built your case. You've already lost the conversation before it really began. So where does that leave us? It leaves us at the beginning of a completely different understanding of what persuasion actually is. Real persuasion, the kind that works consistently across people, across situations, across high-stakes moments where the answer actually matters, has almost nothing to do with making better arguments. It has everything to do with making people feel something first. Robert Cialdini, whose research on influence changed the way behavioral scientists think about human decision-making, spent years studying the most persuasive people across dozens of industries and cultures. What he found wasn't a collection of clever verbal tricks. What he found was a pattern, a consistent way these people approached every interaction before a single persuasive word was spoken. They created conditions. They weren't trying to win the conversation. They were engineering the emotional environment in which the conversation happened so that by the time they made their ask, the other person was already oriented toward yes. Think of it like this. Imagine you're trying to plant a seed. You can have the highest quality seed in the world, but if you drop it into dry, hard, rocky soil, nothing grows. The seed isn't the problem, the soil is. Most people spend all their energy perfecting the seed. They refine their pitch, they sharpen their argument, they practice their delivery, and then they drop the perfect seed into soil they never prepared, and wonder why nothing takes root. The most persuasive people in the world are master gardeners. They prepare the soil first, and by the time they plant the seed, the ground is ready to receive it. What does that look like in practice? It looks like the manager who, before bringing a difficult proposal to her team, has already had individual conversations with each key stakeholder, not to pitch them, but to understand their concerns, validate their perspectives, and let them feel heard. By the time she presents in the room, she's not convincing anyone of anything. She's confirming what people already feel inclined toward. It looks like the father who, before asking his teenage son to make a hard change, sits with him first, no agenda, no lecture, just genuine presence. He asks questions. He listens without redirecting. He makes his son feel understood instead of managed. And when the conversation he actually needs to have finally arrives, the resistance is already gone. It looks like the salesperson who never talks about features in the first meeting, who spends that entire first conversation asking about problems, reflecting back what she's heard, and making the prospect feel seen. Who closes more than anyone on her team, not because she's more aggressive, but because by the time she presents a solution, the prospect already trusts her enough to be moved by it. This is the shift this entire audiobook is built on, from pushing to pulling, from making arguments to creating conditions, from trying to convince people to trying to connect with them first. Here's something worth sitting with. Think about the last time someone genuinely changed your mind about something important, not just got you to comply, but actually shifted something in the way you thought or felt. How did it happen? Almost certainly it didn't happen because they out-argued you. It happened because at some point in the conversation you felt safe. You felt like they understood where you were coming from. You felt like they weren't trying to win, they were trying to reach you. And in that feeling of being understood, your defenses came down just enough for something new to get in. That's not an accident. That's not luck. That's a skill, and it's a learnable one. The people who are consistently persuasive, the ones who seem to have some mysterious ability to bring others around without friction, without pressure, without the exhausting back and forth that wears most conversations down. They've internalized something that most people spend their whole lives missing. They know that before anyone says yes to your idea, they have to say yes to you. Not your logic, not your data, you, your presence, your intention, the feeling they get when they're in a conversation with you. And that the kind of trust and warmth and psychological safety that makes people want to open up and agree is exactly what we're going to build across this audiobook. Chapter by chapter, you're going to develop a complete internal framework for this. Not a set of tricks to memorize and deploy. A genuine shift in how you show up in conversations, one that makes agreement feel natural, that makes people feel good about the choices they make with you, and that turns you into someone others genuinely want to say yes to. Because here's the final thing I want you to hold on to as we go deeper into this. Pressure creates compliance, but connection creates commitment. Pressure might get you the yes in the room, but it poisons everything that comes after. The resentment builds, the trust erodes, and eventually, people find ways to undo what they agreed to, or they simply stop agreeing with you at all. Connection does something different. It makes the yes feel chosen. It makes the person feel respected, understood, and valued. And that kind of yes doesn't just hold, it compounds. People who feel good about saying yes to you once will look for reasons to say yes to you again. That's the kind of influence we're building here. Influence that lasts. Influence that deepens. Influence that doesn't cost you your integrity or your relationships to use. You already have everything you need to develop this. The only thing standing between you and the ability to move people with complete authenticity is understanding how. And that understanding starts now. Chapter 2. The Invisible Architecture of Trust. There's a decision being made about you right now. Not tomorrow, not 5 minutes into the conversation. Right now, in the first seconds of every interaction you have with another human being, people are running an unconscious assessment that will determine whether they open up to you or shut down, whether they lean in or pull back, whether they're willing to be moved by what you say or already looking for reasons to resist it. And the most unsettling part of all of this is that it happens before logic ever enters the room. Before your argument, before your evidence, before your carefully prepared case for why your idea makes sense and why they should get on board, the human brain has already made a preliminary judgment, not about your idea, about you, about whether you are someone safe enough to listen to, someone trustworthy enough to be influenced by, someone whose words are worth letting pass the wall. This is what researchers call the trust threshold, and understanding it will fundamentally change the way you walk into every conversation for the rest of your life. Harvard psychologist Amy Cuddy spent years studying first impressions, specifically what people are actually evaluating when they meet someone new. What she found was startling in its simplicity. When we encounter another person, our brain is asking exactly 2 questions, and it asks them in a very specific order. The first question is not, is this person smart? It's not, is this person competent? It's not even, do I agree with what they're saying? The first question your brain asks about every person you meet is this: can I trust this person? And only after that question gets a satisfactory answer does the second question even become relevant. Can I respect this person's ability? Most people have this completely backwards. They lead with competence. They demonstrate their credentials, establish their expertise, stack up their qualifications, and they do all of that before they've done anything to answer the more primal question sitting at the front of the other person's mind. And what happens when you lead with competence before trust is established? People don't feel informed. They feel sold to. And the moment someone feels sold to, the walls go up faster than anything else you could possibly trigger. Think about the last time a stranger approached you with an impressive pitch for something, maybe a financial product, maybe a business opportunity, and within 30 seconds you'd already checked out mentally, even though nothing they said was technically wrong. That's not you being irrational. That's your brain doing exactly what it was designed to do, protecting you from committing to someone whose intentions it hasn't verified yet. Trust isn't built by being impressive. Trust is built by feeling safe. And safety isn't communicated through your resume. It's communicated through something far more subtle, far more powerful, and far more within your control than most people realize. Let's talk about what actually builds it. Picture 2 managers delivering the exact same feedback to an employee who made a costly mistake on an important project. Same words, same information, same professional delivery, but one manager sits with her arms slightly open, makes warm eye contact, speaks at an unhurried pace, and begins by acknowledging how much pressure the employee has been under lately. The other manager is physically closed off, speaks quickly, as though moving through a checklist, and gets straight to the problem without any preamble. The employee who heard the first manager walks away thinking about how to improve. The employee who heard the second manager walks away feeling attacked and spends the next 3 days replaying the conversation defensively in their head, looking for ways the feedback was unfair. Same content, completely different psychological outcome. Because trust is not built through what you say, it's built through what your entire presence communicates about your intention. And here's the neuroscience behind why that's true. When we interact with another person, our brains are constantly processing what researchers call nonverbal emotional cues, signals transmitted through tone of voice, facial micro-expressions, body posture, breathing pace, and proximity. These signals bypass the rational mind entirely. They go straight to the amygdala, the part of your brain responsible for threat detection, and that structure makes a safety determination before your prefrontal cortex has even begun to process the words being spoken. This is why you can walk into a room, exchange no more than a handshake and a hello with someone, and leave 30 seconds later with a felt sense that this person is either someone you want to know better or someone you want to keep your distance from. You didn't decide that consciously. Your nervous system decided it for you. And this is exactly the mechanism that either opens the door to persuasion or slams it shut before you've said a meaningful word. So what does this mean practically? What are the actual signals that build trust at this pre-rational level, the ones your brain and body are broadcasting in every conversation, whether you are aware of it or not. The first and most foundational signal is presence. Not confidence, not authority, presence. The felt sense that you are fully, completely here with this person right now. That you are not distracted by what you're going to say next. That you are not mentally calculating or strategizing while they speak. That your attention is genuinely, unhurriedly on them. Most people have no idea how rare this is. In a world of divided attention, phones buzzing, minds racing through to-do lists, eyes glazing with the half-listening expression that passes for engagement in most conversations, the experience of someone being truly present with you is so uncommon, it feels almost physical. People feel it, and when they feel it, something in them relaxes in a way that nothing else produces. That relaxation is trust beginning to form, and trust is the soil where yes grows. The second signal is non-judgment in your listening. There is a way of listening to someone that subtly communicates evaluation, a slight tension in the face, a readiness to respond that is more like waiting than receiving, a quality of attention that is auditing rather than absorbing. Most people listen this way and have no idea they're doing it. And most people on the receiving end of that kind of listening feel subtly sometimes, not even consciously, like they're being assessed, like they need to be careful, like vulnerability would be a mistake. And you cannot persuade a person who feels they need to be careful around you. You can pressure them into compliance, but that is not persuasion, that is coercion wearing a more polite face. The kind of listening that builds trust fast is listening where the other person feels that what they say lands, where they can see in your face and feel in the quality of your attention that their words are actually being received, considered, honored, not agreed with necessarily, but heard, genuinely heard in a way that honors the full weight of what they're sharing. The third signal, and this one surprises people, is the willingness to be uncertain. Counterintuitively, nothing erodes trust faster than someone who seems to have all the answers. When someone presents themselves as completely certain, completely prepared, without a crack of doubt or acknowledgement of complexity, something in us becomes suspicious. Because we know life doesn't actually work that way, and we sense at some level that someone performing perfect certainty is more interested in persuading us than in the truth of the conversation. The most trusted communicators are willing to say, "I'm not completely sure about this part," or "I could be wrong here, but this is what I've observed." That kind of intellectual honesty doesn't weaken your persuasive power. It amplifies it enormously, because now when you do speak with certainty, people believe it. The moments where you don't pretend to know everything make the moments where you clearly do know something land with 3 times the authority. Here's where this all connects to persuasion in a way most people miss entirely. Trust doesn't just make conversations easier. Trust actually changes what the other person's brain is physically capable of receiving from you. When someone doesn't trust you, when their nervous system is even slightly on alert in your presence, their cognitive capacity literally narrows. Research on psychological safety shows that under conditions of social threat, the brain's threat detection circuitry consumes processing resources that would otherwise be available for complex reasoning, empathy, and open-minded evaluation. In plain terms, a person who doesn't fully trust you cannot think as clearly or as openly in your presence. They are neurologically less capable of being persuaded by anything you say, no matter how good it is. But when trust is present, when someone feels genuinely safe, genuinely heard, genuinely respected in your presence, the brain opens. Neural pathways that were defended become accessible. The person becomes more curious, more flexible, more willing to consider perspectives that might challenge their existing ones. You are not just making the conversation more pleasant when you build trust first. You are literally increasing the other person's capacity to be moved by what you share with them. That is not a soft, relationship-building insight. That is a hard, neurological, operationally significant understanding of how human minds actually work, and it is the foundation everything else in this audiobook is built upon. Before we move forward, here's what I want you to carry into every conversation this week. Stop leading with your case. Before you make a single point, before you offer a single piece of evidence, before you say the thing you came to say, ask yourself one question. Has this person felt heard yet? Not agreed with? Not managed? Not prepared for your message? Heard. Because here's the truth that changes everything once you really absorb it. People do not resist ideas that come from people they trust. They consider them. They sit with them. They allow themselves to be genuinely moved by them. The invisible architecture of trust is not built in dramatic moments. It is built in quiet ones, in the unhurried pause, in the fully present glance, in the moment where someone expected you to argue and you listened instead. Build that architecture first, and watch how differently people show up for what you say next. Chapter 3. The Language of Agreement. Words are not neutral. Every single word you choose in a conversation carries an invisible emotional charge, a psychological weight that lands in the other person's nervous system before their rational mind has even processed the meaning. And most people have absolutely no awareness of the charge their words are carrying. They think they're communicating information, but what they're actually doing in every sentence they speak is either building a bridge toward agreement or quietly burning it down. This chapter is about learning to feel that charge before you speak. And once you can feel it, once you develop the instinct for which words open people up and which ones close them down, your ability to move people without pressure will become something that feels almost effortless. But first, let's talk about the most persuasion-killing word in the English language. You already know what it is. You've felt it land on you hundreds of times. You've watched conversations shift the moment someone said it, watched the energy in the room change, watched the other person's face tighten almost imperceptibly, watched something that was open and flowing suddenly become guarded and careful. The word is but. And the reason it's so destructive is not grammatical, it's psychological. When you say but in the middle of a sentence, the human brain does something automatic and involuntary. It discards everything that came before the word and treats everything that comes after it as the real message. This is not a figure of speech. This is a documented cognitive pattern studied, replicated, and confirmed across multiple decades of communication research. So when you say to someone, "I really understand where you're coming from, but I think you're missing something important here," what they actually hear is not the first half of that sentence. What they hear is, "You're missing something important." The acknowledgement you offered becomes invisible. The understanding you expressed evaporates. All that remains is the challenge, and the wall goes up immediately in response to it. Now replace that word with one small shift. Say instead, "I really understand where you're coming from, and there's something additional worth considering here." Same information, completely different psychological experience, because "and" doesn't erase what came before it. It builds on it. It signals addition rather than contradiction. It tells the other person's nervous system that you are not here to fight their reality. You are here to expand it. And an expanded reality feels nothing like a threatened one. That single substitution, "but" replaced with "and" is one of the smallest changes you can make in your language and one of the most consequential. Practice it for 1 week and notice what shifts in your conversations. But the language of agreement goes much deeper than single word substitutions. It operates at the level of entire conversational architecture's patterns in the way you structure your communication that either orient people toward openness or quietly trigger resistance before you've made a single substantive point. Let's talk about one of the most powerful of those patterns. Psychologists and elite negotiators call it pacing and leading, and once you understand it, you will see it operating everywhere, in every high-stakes conversation you've ever witnessed or been part of. Here's how it works. Before you introduce any idea that requires someone to shift their thinking, you first spend real, unhurried time accurately reflecting back the reality they're already living in, not validating it necessarily, not agreeing with it, but demonstrating through the precision and care of your language that you genuinely understand their current experience. This is pacing. You match where they are before you try to move them anywhere. Think about what this does neurologically. When someone hears their own inner experience reflected back to them, their frustrations named accurately, their concerns articulated more clearly than they could have done themselves, something profound happens in their brain. The threat detection system quiets. The defensiveness that was coiled and ready to spring begins to release. And in that moment of feeling truly understood, the person becomes, for the first time in the conversation, genuinely open to being led somewhere new. That's leading, and it only works after pacing has done its job. Here's what this looks like in a real conversation that many of you will recognize immediately. Imagine a husband and wife who've been going in circles about a major financial decision. Maybe it's buying a house. Maybe it's a career change. Maybe it's an investment that one of them feels excited about and the other feels deeply uncertain of. They've had this conversation 4 times already. Every time, it ends the same way, not in resolution, but in exhausted stalemate. Because every time, both of them lead with their position. Both of them start at the conclusion and work backward. And both of them, without realizing it, are doing everything their language can do to trigger the other person's resistance. Now watch what happens when one of them shifts. Instead of opening with, "I really think we should do this, and here's why it makes sense," they say something different. They say, "I know this decision feels risky to you. I know you've seen things go wrong before when people make moves like this without enough certainty. And I know that protecting what we built together matters to you more than almost anything else." Full stop. No pivot. No sneaking in the persuasive point immediately after. Just accurate, unhurried reflection of the other person's actual experience. What happens in that moment is not small. The person who expected another round of the argument suddenly feels something they didn't expect to feel seen. And a person who feels seen is no longer in a defensive posture. They're in an open one, which means that when you eventually do introduce your perspective calmly, without pressure, as an addition rather than a contradiction, they are neurologically capable of actually receiving it. This is pacing and leading, and it is one of the most quietly powerful communication skills a human being can develop. Now let's talk about another dimension of the language of agreement, one that most people overlook entirely because it doesn't involve the words you choose at all. It involves the words you don't say. There is a particular kind of communicator that almost everyone has encountered, the person who, in any conversation about an idea or a decision, feels compelled to fill every available silence with more persuasion, more evidence, more reasoning, more words layered on top of words, as though the sheer volume of their communication will eventually wear down the other person's resistance. And the effect of this approach is exactly the opposite of what's intended, because when someone keeps adding more arguments, more support, more reasons, what the other person's brain registers is not thoroughness. What it registers is anxiety. It interprets the relentlessness of the communication as a signal that the speaker is not fully confident in what they're saying, that they need the volume of their words to compensate for some internal uncertainty. And that interpretation, whether consciously articulated or not, makes people less likely to trust the message, not more. The most persuasive communicators understand that silence is not the absence of influence. Silence is often the peak of it. When you make a genuinely powerful point, and then stop when you allow that point to land in the space between you and the other person, without immediately burying it under more words, You give it room to do its work. You signal that you trust what you just said. You demonstrate a confidence that doesn't need external validation. And that quality of stillness and trust is extraordinarily compelling in a world where most people never stop talking long enough to let their words breathe. There's one more element of language worth going deep on in this chapter, and it might be the most counterintuitive thing we'll cover in this entire audiobook. The most persuasive thing you can often say in a conversation is an honest acknowledgement of the other side's argument. Not a dismissal of it, not a token acknowledgement followed immediately by a but. A genuine, specific, fair articulation of why a reasonable person might disagree with you, followed by your perspective, offered not as a refutation, but as an alternative lens. This technique has a name in the world of rhetoric. It's called steel manning, as opposed to the far more common and far less effective practice of straw manning, where you summarize the opposing view in its weakest possible form so you can knock it down easily. When you steel man someone's position, when you say, "Here's the strongest version of the concern you might have about this, and I want to take it seriously," something remarkable happens. The other person stops fighting, because the thing they were bracing to defend has just been defended for them more eloquently than they might have done it themselves. Their energy, which was organized around resistance, suddenly has nowhere to go, and in that disarmed state, they become genuinely curious about what you're going to say next. This is not a trick. It is one of the deepest forms of intellectual respect you can offer another person, and people who feel intellectually respected are among the most persuadable people in the world because you've made it safe for them to change their mind without feeling like they've lost something. Here's what I want you to take into your next conversation, not as a technique to deploy, but as a genuine orientation to try on. Before you say anything designed to move someone, ask yourself 3 questions. Have you accurately reflected their current reality? Have you said what needed to be said and then stopped, trusting the silence to do the rest? Have you acknowledged the legitimate weight of their concerns before offering your own perspective? If the answer to those 3 questions is yes, if you've paced before you've led, if you've listened more than you've spoken, if you've honored the other side before presenting your own, then when you finally do make your point, you won't need to push it. It will land on its own, because you've built the conditions in which landing is possible. And that is the difference between language that persuades and language that merely argues. One asks people to surrender. The other makes them feel safe enough to choose. Chapter 4. The emotion behind every decision. Here is something that will quietly reorganize the way you think about every important conversation you've ever had or will ever have. Nobody, not a single human being who has ever lived, has made a major decision based on logic alone. Not the executive who spent 3 months analyzing spreadsheets before committing to $1 billion acquisition. Not the scientist who dedicated a decade of their life to a research question others called unanswerable. Not the person who spent 6 months comparing mortgage rates, neighborhood statistics, and school district rankings before choosing a home. Not one of them. Because in every single case without exception, if you could get inside the decision at the moment it was actually made, what you would find at the center of it is not a calculation. What you would find is a feeling. Logic built the case. Logic organized the reasoning. Logic provided the after-the-fact justification that made the decision feel responsible and defensible. But the decision itself, the actual turning point where maybe became yes, was emotional. It always is. And the sooner you accept that as a fact of human nature, rather than a flaw in human character, the sooner you stop fighting the way people actually work and start working with it instead. Antonio Damasio is a neuroscientist at the University of Southern California who has spent his career studying patients with damage to the emotional centers of their brains, specifically the region called the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, which integrates emotional signals into the decision-making process. What he found in these patients was something that turned a century of assumptions about rational decision-making completely upside down. These patients were highly intelligent. Their reasoning abilities were completely intact. They could analyze situations with extraordinary precision, weigh options methodically, and articulate the logical pros and cons of any decision with clinical accuracy. By every conventional measure, they should have been exceptional decision-makers, more rational, more objective, more free from the emotional biases that supposedly cloud normal human judgment. But here's what actually happened when they were faced with real decisions, even simple ones, like choosing between 2 appointment times or deciding where to have lunch. They couldn't decide at all. Without the emotional signal, without the felt sense of this matters, or this feels right, or this won, the rational mind had no way to resolve between options. It could generate reasons for and against indefinitely, but it couldn't choose, because choosing requires caring, and caring is an emotional act, not a logical one. Damasio called this the somatic marker hypothesis. The idea that emotions are not obstacles to good decision-making, but are in fact the essential mechanism through which decisions get made. Emotions are not the enemy of reason, they are the engine that reason runs on. And what this means for persuasion is profound and irreversible once you truly understand it. If you want to move someone toward a decision, in any context, at any level of significance, you cannot start with a logical case. Not because the logical case doesn't matter, it does, but because logic, presented to an emotionally unmoved person, is experienced as pressure, as information to be evaluated and potentially resisted, as a challenge to the existing position rather than an invitation toward a new one. But emotion, the right emotion, activated in the right sequence, does something entirely different. It creates movement. It orients the person. It makes them feel that something is at stake, that something matters, that there is a direction worth moving in. And once a person is emotionally oriented toward a direction, they will find the logical reasons to justify moving that way. They will, in many cases, do your logical work for you. This is not manipulation. This is meeting people where the actual decision-making happens in the feeling body, not the analytical mind. Consider how this plays out in a context most people in this audience know intimately, the workplace conversation where you need to convince a skeptical colleague or manager to support your idea. Most people walk into that conversation armed with data, projections, case studies, comparable examples, risk assessments. They present the information in the most organized, thorough way they can manage, and then they watch as their manager nods politely, says something like, "Let me think about it," and the idea quietly disappears into the space where unconvincing proposals go to die. Now, imagine a different approach. Before the data, before the projections, before a single slide, you spend 5 minutes talking about a problem, not your solution to the problem itself, specifically the human cost of that problem, the frustration it creates for the team, the opportunities it's causing everyone to miss, the quiet toll it takes on people who care about doing their work well. You name these things with specificity and honesty. You make the pain real and present in the room rather than abstract and theoretical. And then only then you introduce your idea as the relief from that pain. What you've done is not dressed up your presentation with emotional window dressing. You've changed the neurological context in which your idea will be received. Your manager is no longer evaluating a proposal. They are looking for a solution to a problem they are now feeling. And a mind in search of relief is a mind that is open, motivated, and actively looking to say yes. There's a specific emotional sequence that the most effective persuaders understand and use, not cynically, but as a genuine structure for helping people connect with what actually matters in a given situation. Researchers who study narrative persuasion describe it as the journey from pain to possibility. It begins with acknowledgement, meeting the person inside whatever difficulty or frustration or unmet need already exists in their experience. Not manufacturing emotions that aren't there, not exaggerating or dramatizing, simply naming with precision and empathy what is genuinely hard about their current situation. Then it moves to stakes, helping the person connect with what continues to be lost if nothing changes, not threatening them, not creating fear artificially, but honestly illuminating the cost of staying where they are in terms that matter to them specifically, not in terms that matter to your argument. And finally, it arrives at possibility, the felt sense of a different reality, a better outcome, a version of their situation where the thing that is currently hard has been resolved, not described analytically, painted, made real and vivid and emotionally inhabitable before a single logical detail is introduced. When you move someone through that sequence, paying to stakes to possibility, you are not tricking them into feeling something false. You are helping them access something true that was already there but hadn't been fully felt yet. And when people feel the full truth of their own situation, when the stakes become real and the possibility becomes vivid, they don't need to be convinced to move. They want to move. The yes becomes their own. Think about the most influential communicators you've ever encountered, the leaders, teachers, speakers, writers, whose words genuinely changed something in you. Were they the ones who gave you the most comprehensive information? Were they the ones with the most rigorous logical frameworks, or the most exhaustive supporting evidence? Almost certainly not. The ones who changed you were the ones who made you feel something first, who found the precise emotional frequency of your own experience and reflected it back to you so accurately that you felt suddenly, unexpectedly understood. And in that feeling of being understood, something in you opened. Your defenses came down. Your mind became flexible in a way it wasn't before the feeling arrived. And in that flexible, open, emotionally engaged state, you received something that actually moved you. That is not accidental. That is the human nervous system operating exactly as it was designed to operate, and persuaders who understand this don't fight it or try to route around it. They work with it as the most powerful tool available to any communicator who is serious about creating genuine change. Here's something worth being honest about as we go deeper into this territory. Some people feel uncomfortable with the idea of leading with emotion in persuasion. They worry it's somehow dishonest, that it's a way of bypassing the rational mind and getting people to agree to things they wouldn't agree to if they were thinking clearly. But consider what the alternative actually looks like in practice. Pure logical persuasion, stripped of emotional context, doesn't produce clearer decisions. It produces paralysis. We know this from Damasio's patients. Without emotional signal, the rational mind spins indefinitely. Logic without emotion doesn't lead to better choices. It leads to no choices at all. The most ethical approach to persuasion is not to eliminate emotion from the conversation. It's to make sure the emotions you activate are true ones, real stakes, real possibilities, real acknowledgement of real experiences. To use emotional language not to manufacture urgency that doesn't exist, but to help people feel the genuine importance of something they may have been intellectually aware of, but not yet fully alive to. That distinction between activating true emotions and manufacturing false ones is the entire difference between persuasion and manipulation. And it is a distinction worth holding on to with great care, because it is the line that separates influence that serves people from influence that uses them. Carry this into your next important conversation. Before you make your case, ask yourself what emotion is already present in this person's experience that is directly relevant to what you're trying to help them see. Not what emotion would be convenient for your argument. What emotion is already there waiting to be named, honored, and connected to the decision at hand. Find that emotion, name it honestly. Let it breathe in the space between you before you move toward anything else. Because when people feel that you understand not just their situation, but their experience of their situation, the invisible emotional texture of what they're living through, they stop protecting themselves from you. And a person who has stopped protecting themselves from you is a person who is truly, finally ready to hear what you have to say. Logic will close the deal, but emotion opens the door, and no deal in the history of human connection was ever closed through a door that was never opened. Chapter 5. The Art of Asking the Right Questions. There is a moment in every important conversation that most people completely misread. It's the moment when the other person goes quiet, not because they've shut down, not because they've disengaged, but because something you said or asked has sent them somewhere internal. You can see it in their face, the slight pause, the eyes that shift slightly, as though reading something written on the inside of their own thinking, the almost imperceptible softening of whatever tension was present just a moment before. Most people, when they encounter this moment, panic. The silence feels like danger, like losing ground, like the conversation is slipping away from them, so they fill it with more words, more evidence, more persuasion, and in doing so, they destroy the most valuable thing that was happening in that entire exchange. Because that moment of internal quiet is not the conversation dying. That moment is the conversation doing its deepest work, and the thing that triggered it 9 times out of 10 was not a statement. It was a question. The right question, asked with genuine curiosity and then honored with genuine silence, is the single most powerful persuasive instrument available to any human being in any conversation. And almost nobody uses it well. Here's why questions work at a level that statements can never reach. When you make a statement, even a brilliant, well-timed, emotionally resonant statement, you are still the author of that thought. It came from you. It lives initially in the space between you and the other person, and for it to become persuasive, it has to travel across that space and be accepted by the other person's mind, which means it has to get past the filter, the automatic, unconscious resistance mechanism that evaluates incoming ideas for threat and compatibility with existing beliefs. Some statements get through, many don't. The filter is powerful, and it operates faster than conscious thought. But when you ask a question, a genuinely open, thoughtfully constructed question, something entirely different happens. You are not sending a thought across the space between you. You are activating a thought inside the other person's own mind. The idea doesn't have to travel anywhere. It doesn't have to get past any filter. It emerges from within the person themselves, which means their brain doesn't experience it as an incoming challenge. It experiences it as a self-generated insight. And here's the neurological reality that makes this so significant. We are vastly more persuaded by thoughts we believe we generated ourselves than by thoughts someone else delivered to us, even when the content is identical. This is why the Socratic method, developed by a philosopher who understood human psychology more deeply than almost anyone before or since, has survived as the most effective teaching and persuasion framework in human history. Socrates never told anyone what to think. He asked questions so precisely constructed that his students arrived at the truth themselves, and having arrived at it themselves, they owned it in a way that no delivered argument could have produced. You have that same instrument available to you in every conversation you have. The question is whether you know how to use it. Let's talk about the specific architecture of questions that shift people's internal orientation toward yes. The first category is what skilled negotiators and therapists call perspective-expanding questions. These are questions that don't challenge someone's existing position, but invite them to view their situation from an angle they haven't considered yet. They sound like this. What would it mean for you personally if this problem was still in exactly the same place a year from now? Or, if you imagine the version of yourself who made this work, what do you think they saw that made them decide to move forward? Or, What's the cost you're already paying by staying where you currently are? Notice what these questions are not doing. They are not arguing. They are not presenting counter-evidence. They are not trying to dismantle the person's resistance by attacking it directly. They are simply expanding the frame through which the person is viewing their situation, inviting them to consider dimensions of their reality that their current thinking might be leaving out. And when someone's frame expands when they suddenly see a dimension of their situation they hadn't fully considered, their resistance doesn't need to be overcome. It dissolves on its own, because resistance is almost always a function of a narrowed frame, and a well-constructed question is the most elegant frame expander that exists. The second category is what researchers who study motivational interviewing call change talk. Eliciting questions and understanding this category will change the way you approach every conversation where you need someone to move from where they are to somewhere new. Here's the principle behind them. Every person who is resistant to a change or a decision is not uniformly resistant. Inside their resistance, there is almost always a part of them that already sees the value of moving a part that is quietly drawn toward the change, even while the dominant voice is saying no. This ambivalence is not weakness. It is the completely normal internal architecture of a human being confronting any meaningful decision. Most persuaders try to argue against the resistance. They push against the no, hoping to overpower it with enough evidence and logic. But this approach misses the most available opening entirely, which is to find the yes that already exists inside the person and give it more room to speak. Change talk eliciting questions do exactly that. They sound like, what is it about this that actually makes sense to you, even if you're not fully committed yet? Or, has there been a moment recently where you've thought that something needs to change here? Or, what would have to be true for you to feel good about moving forward? These questions do something extraordinary. They invite the person to become the advocate for their own movement. They shift the person from a defensive posture protecting their existing position against your challenge to an exploratory one, articulating to themselves and to you the part of them that is already oriented toward yes. And here's the crucial insight. Once someone has spoken their own reasons for moving forward, those reasons have infinitely more power over their subsequent behavior than any reason you could have given them from the outside. You didn't persuade them. You gave their own persuasion a voice, and now it belongs to them completely. Most people ask questions and then half listen to the response while internally preparing their next move. The question was a setup, a technique deployed to create the appearance of curiosity while the real agenda was waiting in the wings. And people feel this. They may not name it consciously, but something in them registers the performance quality of the attention, the sense that the question was a means to an end, rather than a genuine invitation to be heard. Real question, asking the kind that builds the deep trust that makes everything else possible, requires a quality of listening that most of us have to consciously practice because our conversational habits have trained it out of us. It requires what therapists call active presence, the discipline of hearing not just the words someone speaks, but the meaning beneath the words, the concern behind the objection, the need behind the resistance, the hope buried inside the hesitation. When you listen at that level, when your questions are genuine and your attention to the answers is complete, people experience something rare enough that it stops them mid-thought. They realize they are being truly heard, not managed, not directed, not strategically redirected toward a predetermined conclusion. Heard. And in that experience of being genuinely heard, people become extraordinarily open not just to your influence, but to their own deeper thinking. Some of the most effective persuasive conversations in history, it didn't involve the persuader saying anything particularly clever at all. They involved someone asking one genuinely curious question, listening with complete attention to the answer, and then asking one more question that went one layer deeper, over and over, with patience and real interest, until the other person had essentially talked themselves into the exact clarity and motivation that the conversation needed to produce. Here's a mistake that even people who understand the power of questions make consistently. They ask the right question and then answer it themselves. They ask, "What do you think would happen if we try this approach?" And before the other person has had 3 seconds to actually consider it, they're already filling the silence with their own answer. Because I think what would happen is... This is a reflex born from anxiety. The silence feels uncomfortable. The space feels like a gap that needs to be filled, and the impulse to fill it with your own thinking is almost overwhelming for most people in most conversations. But that impulse, however understandable, destroys the very mechanism that made the question powerful, because the value was never in the question itself. The value was in the thinking the question was designed to activate in the other person. When you answer your own question, you short-circuit that thinking before it can complete itself. You take the inside back out of the other person's hands and put it back in yours, where it has a fraction of the persuasive power it would have had if they'd arrived at it themselves. Ask the question, then stop. Honor the silence with everything you have. Let it do its work. There is a practice worth adopting before your next significant conversation, one that the most consistently persuasive people in business, in relationships, and in leadership quietly build their entire communication approach around. Before you decide what you are going to say in a conversation, spend time deciding what you are going to ask, not as a technique, not as a strategy to deploy at a calculated moment, but as a genuine act of curiosity, an honest desire to understand the other person's reality more fully before you introduce your own. What don't you know about how they're experiencing this situation? What assumption are you carrying about their resistance that might be completely wrong? What question, if they sat with it honestly for 60 seconds, might help them see something about their own situation that would make your idea feel not like a challenge to their existing thinking, but like the natural next step of it? Ask that question. Then listen as though their answer is the most important thing you'll hear today, because in the conversation you're having, the one that actually matters, it probably is. The deepest truth about persuasion is this: the person who asks the best questions is almost never the person who talks the most. They're the person who listens the most carefully to the answers, and in that careful listening, they find exactly where the door is and exactly how gently it needs to be opened. Chapter 6. The confidence that doesn't push. There are 2 kinds of confidence in this world. You have encountered both of them. You know the difference the moment you feel it, even if you've never had words for exactly what you were sensing. One kind of confidence draws you in. It makes you want to listen, want to lean forward, want to trust the person who carries it. The other kind repels you. It makes you want to step back, put up your guard, become suddenly aware that you need to protect something. The first kind is what this chapter is about. The second kind, the loud, performative, pressure-filled kind, is what most people default to when the stakes are high and they desperately need someone to say yes. And that default, as we're going to explore deeply today, is one of the most reliable ways to guarantee the exact outcome you're trying to avoid. Because here's the uncomfortable truth, that most confident-seeming people never fully confronted the version of confidence that pushes, that presses, that performs its certainty at high volume and high intensity, is not actually confidence at all. It is anxiety wearing confidence as a costume, and people feel the difference in their bones even when they can't articulate why. Think about the last time someone tried very hard to convince you of something. Not the content of what they were saying, set that aside entirely. Focus purely on the felt experience of being in that conversation, the energy of it, the quality of their presence, the way it landed in your body. If they were pushing, if there was an urgency to their communication that felt like pressure, like they needed your agreement more than they were simply offering you information. What happened in you? Did you feel pulled toward them? Did their intensity make you more open, more curious, more willing to be moved? Almost certainly not. Almost certainly what happened was something more like contraction, a subtle pulling back, a quiet internal voice that said something feels off here, even if everything they said was technically reasonable and logically sound. That feeling, that instinctive withdrawal in the presence of pushed confidence, is one of the most consistent and universal responses in all of human social psychology. And it operates below the level of conscious reasoning, which means it cannot be argued away or logically overridden. It is your nervous system doing its job, detecting the anxious energy beneath the performance and protecting you from being stampeded into a decision by someone who needs your agreement for reasons that have more to do with their own insecurity than with your genuine benefit. Now, contrast that with the experience of being in a conversation with someone who is genuinely, quietly, groundedly certain of what they believe without needing you to confirm it. Someone whose confidence doesn't require your agreement to exist. Someone who makes their case with clarity and warmth and then simply waits, unhurried, present, unbothered by the possibility that you might say no. How does that feel? Completely different. Because instead of pressure which triggers resistance, you feel something closer to respect. And respect, in the context of persuasion, is one of the most powerful opening forces that exists. Psychologists who study social influence have a term for this quality. They call it non-attachment to outcome, and it is one of the most paradoxical and consistently observed phenomena in the entire field of persuasion research. The less visibly attached a person is to receiving a particular response, the more likely they are to receive it. This runs counter to everything our instincts tell us about how persuasion works. Our instincts say, show them how much this matters to you. Demonstrate the strength of your conviction. Let them feel the importance of the decision by feeling your intensity about it. But human psychology doesn't respond to desperation with generosity. It responds to desperation with distance, because desperation signals need, and need creates pressure, and pressure, as we've established across every chapter of this audiobook, is the single most reliable generator of resistance available in any human interaction. Non-attachment, on the other hand, communicates something entirely different. It communicates that you are complete regardless of the outcome, that your belief in what you're offering doesn't depend on their validation, that you are here with genuine information and genuine care, but that their choice, ultimately, is theirs. And paradoxically, that freedom, the felt sense that no one is trying to take anything from you, is precisely what makes people feel safe enough to choose the thing being offered. This is not passivity. This is not indifference dressed up as strategy. This is a deep, active, internally cultivated confidence that has learned to lead with presence rather than pressure. And it is learnable, but only if you first understand where performative confidence actually comes from. Performative confidence, the pushed, pressure-filled kind, has one consistent source regardless of how it manifests in different people in different situations. It comes from what psychologists call an external locus of validation. The person performing confidence is not actually confident, they are dependent on the response of others to tell them whether what they think, feel, and believe has value. And because that validation is external and therefore uncontrollable, every high-stakes conversation becomes a referendum on their worth. Every potential no is not just a rejection of their idea, it is a rejection of them. Which is why the energy they bring to persuasion carries that particular quality of desperation, because psychologically for them, the stakes genuinely are that high. And people feel this, not consciously, not analytically, but in the body, in the nervous system, in the instinctive social radar that every human being carries as part of their evolutionary inheritance. The person whose confidence is internally grounded feels fundamentally different to be around than the person whose confidence is a performance built on a foundation of needing your approval. The internally grounded person feels safe. The performer feels dangerous, not maliciously, but in the specific way that any needy, approval-dependent energy feels dangerous to the autonomy of the person being asked to provide the validation. So how do you build the first kind? The foundation of genuine, non-pushing confidence is what we might call conviction rooted in understanding. Most people try to build confidence by accumulating certainty, by knowing more, preparing more, rehearsing more, until the possibility of being caught without an answer feels remote enough to relax into. And while preparation matters, this approach misses the deeper source of the confidence that actually moves people. The communicators who carry the most naturally persuasive presence are not the ones who are most certain they are right. They are the ones who are most deeply connected to why what they're offering genuinely matters not to their argument, not to their outcome, but to the person sitting across from them. Think about a doctor delivering a treatment recommendation to a patient who is hesitant and afraid. The doctor who is confident in the bureaucratic, performance-oriented sense will push through the hesitation with authority and expertise, relying on credentials and clinical certainty to override the patient's fear. And the patient may comply, but they will comply without genuine understanding, without real ownership of the decision, and with a residue of anxiety that no amount of clinical confidence addressed. The doctor who carries the quiet, grounded, genuinely persuasive confidence will do something different. They will sit with the patient's fear, first name it, honor it, make it feel seen rather than bypassed. And from that place of genuine connection to what the patient is actually experiencing, they will speak about the treatment not as an authority issuing a directive, but as someone who truly deeply cares about this specific human being's well-being and whose confidence comes entirely from that care. Same recommendation, completely different felt experience, and a completely different quality of yes when the patient finally gives it. There is a practice that the most naturally authoritative communicators do, often unconsciously, having developed it through years of high-stakes interaction that you can begin doing deliberately, starting today. Before any conversation where you need to influence someone, spend a few moments connecting not with your argument, but with your intention. Ask yourself honestly, why does this matter for this specific person? Not why does it matter for your numbers or your goals or your agenda? Why does it genuinely matter for them, their life, their work, their growth, their well-being? What do you actually want for this person beyond getting them to agree with you? What would you want for them if agreeing with you wasn't even an option? When you can answer that question clearly and honestly, when your intention is genuinely oriented around their benefit rather than your outcome, something shifts in the quality of your presence that no amount of preparation or performance can replicate. Your confidence stops being about you entirely. It becomes about something larger than the transaction of the conversation, and that quality confidence in service of genuine care is felt as trustworthiness at the deepest level of human social perception. People are not persuaded by the most prepared person in the room. They are persuaded by the person they trust most, and the person they trust most is almost always the one whose confidence, however quietly it is carried, feels like it exists entirely for their benefit, rather than for the speaker's own need to be right. Here's the final thing to carry forward from this chapter, and it is perhaps the most important single idea in this entire audiobook. Confidence that pushes creates compliance. Confidence that grounds creates commitment. Compliance is what you get when someone says yes, because the pressure of saying no became too uncomfortable to sustain. A commitment is what you get when someone says yes, because they genuinely believe, in a way that belongs entirely to them, that yes is the right answer. Compliance evaporates the moment the pressure does. commitment deepens over time. Every person you've ever persuaded through pressure knows, somewhere beneath the surface of their agreement, that they were pushed rather than led. That knowledge doesn't disappear, it accumulates. And what it accumulates into, over enough interactions, is a quiet but growing resistance to your influence that no amount of better arguments will ever fully overcome. But every person you've ever led with genuine, grounded, non-pushing confidence, every person who said yes because they felt genuinely respected, heard, and free to choose carries that experience forward with them too. And what it accumulates into is trust. Deep, durable, compounding trust that makes every subsequent conversation easier, every subsequent yes more available, every subsequent influence more natural and more complete. That is what genuine confidence builds. Not a single yes extracted under pressure, but a relationship in which yes becomes the natural response because in your presence it always feels like the person's own idea. Chapter 7. Reading the Room. There is a conversation happening right now beneath the conversation you think you're having. In every exchange, every negotiation, every difficult discussion, every moment where something important is being decided between two or more human beings, there are always two simultaneous streams of communication running in parallel. There is the surface stream, the words being spoken, the arguments being made, the explicit content of the exchange that both parties are consciously aware of and consciously responding to. And then there is the deeper stream, the one that carries the actual emotional truth of what is happening between people, the one that lives in the slight tension around someone's eyes when they say, "No, I'm fine," and mean the opposite, the one that lives in the fractional pause before someone answers a question, the pause that tells you they're managing their response rather than simply giving it, the one that lives in the crossed arms, the shifted weight, the breath that gets held just a little too long, the smile that arrives half a second too late to be genuine. Most people are almost entirely focused on the surface stream. They respond to the words and miss the music entirely. And in doing so, they navigate conversations with a fraction of the information that is actually available to them, making moves based on what people say rather than what people mean, and wondering why their persuasion so often lands in entirely the wrong place. The most naturally persuasive people in any room are not the ones talking the most. They are the ones reading the most, gathering information from the deeper stream in real time, and using that information to respond not to the surface of the conversation, but to the emotional truth underneath it. This chapter is about developing that capacity, and once you develop it, you will never be able to turn it off. Let's start with the science of what you're actually reading when you read a room accurately. In 1967, psychologist Albert Mehrabian published research that became one of the most cited and most misunderstood findings in the history of communication science. His research suggested that in emotionally significant communication, the words themselves carry only a small fraction of the total message. The overwhelming majority is carried through tone of voice and nonverbal behavior. The specific numbers have been debated and contextualized extensively since then, but the core insight has proven remarkably durable across decades of subsequent research. When there is a mismatch between what someone's words say and what their body and voice communicate, human beings almost universally trust the nonverbal signal over the verbal one. Your brain knows this instinctively. When someone tells you they're not angry, but their jaw is tight, and their voice has that particular flat quality that has always preceded difficult conversations in your experience, you don't believe the words, you believe the jaw, you believe the voice, because at the level of your nervous system, you already understand that words are constructed consciously while the body leaks truth continuously. The question is not whether you pick up these signals, you do, whether you're aware of it or not. The question is whether you're paying conscious enough attention to use what you're receiving. There are 4 specific channels of nonverbal communication that the most perceptive communicators read simultaneously, and developing awareness of each one will fundamentally change the quality of information you have available in any significant conversation. The first channel is micro-expressions, the involuntary, fleeting facial movements that flash across a person's face in fractions of a second before the conscious mind can suppress or manage them. Psychologist Paul Ekman, who spent decades mapping the relationship between emotion and facial movement, identified 7 universal micro-expressions that appear consistently across cultures, ages, and backgrounds: fear, anger, disgust, contempt, surprise, sadness, and happiness. These expressions appear and disappear in as little as 1/15 of a second. Most people miss them entirely in normal conversation because they're not looking for them. But when you train your attention, when you make a conscious practice of watching faces rather than just listening to words, these micro-expressions become readable. And what they tell you often contradicts the verbal message being delivered with complete confidence. The person who says, "I love this idea," while a flash of contempt crosses their face in the half-second before the words arrive, that person is not telling you the truth, not necessarily lying deliberately, but their emotional reality is not matching their verbal output, and knowing that gives you information that changes everything about how you respond. The second channel is vocal tonality, the emotional information carried not in what someone says but in how their voice sounds while they're saying it. Pace, pitch, rhythm, resonance, the presence or absence of breath support in the voice. These qualities shift measurably in response to emotional states, and they shift in consistent, readable ways across people. Anxiety speeds up the pace and raises the pitch. Genuine confidence slows the pace and deepens the resonance. Concealed discomfort often produces a particular flatness, a voice that has been carefully stripped of its normal variation, as though the person is monitoring it closely to prevent something from getting out. One of the most useful vocal signals to learn to recognize is what linguists call uptalk, the pattern where declarative statements are delivered with a rising intonation of a question. When someone is uncertain or seeking approval, their voice rises at the end of their sentences, even when the sentence grammatically requires no such rise. They are unconsciously asking for permission, for confirmation that what they just said is acceptable. Recognizing this pattern in real time tells you something crucial about where this person actually is emotionally, regardless of how confident the content of their words might sound. The third channel is postural and gestural communication, the information carried by how people hold and move their bodies during interaction. The body is extraordinarily expressive in ways that are largely involuntary. When people feel genuinely engaged and open, they orient toward the source of that engagement. They turn toward you, their posture opens, their weight shifts slightly forward. When they feel threatened or resistant, they do the opposite. They turn slightly away, create physical distance, cross their arms or legs as a literal physical barrier between themselves and the perceived threat. But the most valuable postural signals to learn to read are not the obvious ones, crossed arms, turned bodies, but the subtler ones that most people miss. The micro movement of someone leaning back by 2 inches in their chair when you introduce a particular idea. The slight stiffening of the shoulders that signals that something in the conversation just landed in a place that feels threatening. The unconscious self-soothing gestures touching the neck, rubbing the hands together, briefly covering the mouth that indicate rising discomfort that the person is not ready to verbally acknowledge. These are not performance. They are leakage, involuntary physical expressions of emotional states that the person may be consciously trying to manage or conceal, and when you read them accurately, you have access to the real-time emotional truth of the conversation in a way that transforms your ability to respond to what is actually happening rather than what is being presented. The fourth channel, and in many ways the most powerful, is the architecture of silence. what people don't say, when they don't say it, and the quality of the silence around what gets left out. These are among the richest sources of information available in any conversation, and they require a particular quality of attention to read accurately because the instinct of most conversationalists is to fill silence rather than read it. There are specific silence patterns worth learning to recognize. The pause before a yes that comes too quickly, where someone agrees without the brief processing beat that genuine agreement requires, often signals compliance rather than conviction. The person is managing the interaction, not responding to it. They will agree in the room and reconsider outside it. Their yes is not a real yes yet. The way someone talks around a topic, approaching it from multiple angles without ever landing directly on it, often signals that the topic itself carries more emotional weight than they're ready to openly acknowledge. The thing they keep not quite saying is frequently the most important thing in the conversation. And the subject that gets changed too readily, the question that gets answered with another question, the redirect that arrives with a slightly too smooth social grace. This almost always marks the location of something significant, something that matters enough to be managed rather than met directly. When you start reading silence as actively as you read speech, when you treat the gaps and the redirections and the avoidances as data rather than as empty space, the information available to you in any conversation expands dramatically. Now, here is where all of this connects to persuasion in a way that goes beyond mere observation. Reading the room accurately is not a passive skill. It is the foundation of what the most effective persuaders do that separates them from everyone else, the ability to calibrate in real time. Most people enter a persuasive conversation with a plan and execute that plan regardless of what the other person's signals are communicating. They've decided what they're going to say, in what order, with what emphasis, and they deliver it with the faithfulness of someone reading from a script. Even when the other person's nonverbal communication is clearly saying, "You've lost me," or "This is hitting something tender," or "I was with you until that point, but now I'm not," the plan continues. The script gets read to its conclusion, and the conversation ends without the speaker ever knowing exactly where the connection was lost. The persuader who reads the room stops when the signals shift. They pause when the micro-expression contradicts the verbal agreement. They redirect when the posture closes. They name what they're observing gently, without accusation, with genuine curiosity when the silence grows heavy with something unspoken. They say things like, "I noticed something shifted just now. Did that land in a way I didn't intend?" Or, "Something tells me there's a concern here we haven't quite gotten to yet." Or simply, "What are you thinking right now that you haven't said out loud?" These interventions, these moments of naming what the room is actually communicating, do something extraordinary in a conversation. They signal to the other person that you are paying attention at a level that goes beyond the surface of what they're saying, that you are present enough, perceptive enough, and safe enough to hold whatever is actually happening in the room, including the parts they haven't yet been ready to voice. And that signal, that felt sense of being truly deeply seen, is one of the most powerful trust-building experiences available in human interaction. Here's what reading the room really comes down to at its most fundamental level. Every person you will ever try to persuade is carrying something into the conversation that they may never directly tell you. A fear, a past experience that makes this particular decision feel heavier than it might otherwise. A loyalty to a position that has more to do with identity than logic. A concern so vulnerable that naming it out loud would feel like exposure. Your words, however well chosen, however emotionally resonant, however logically compelling, cannot reach what stays hidden. They slide past it. They address the surface and leave the depth untouched. And the depth is almost always where the real decision is being made. But your attention can reach it. Your presence can reach it. The quality of perception that says, "I see more than your words, and I'm not afraid of what I see, that reaches people in places that nothing else can access. Read the room not to gain advantage over people. Read it to understand them more completely than they may understand themselves in that moment, and then respond not to what they said, but to what they meant. Not to the surface of the conversation, but to the emotional truth running beneath it. Because the most persuasive response you can ever give anyone is the one that meets them exactly where they actually are. Not where the words suggested they were, but where the whole of their presence, read carefully and received with genuine care, revealed them to be. That is the art of reading the room, and it is inseparable from the art of being someone that rooms want to open up to. Chapter 8. Handling resistance without breaking the connection. The moment resistance arrives in a conversation, most people make the same mistake. They treat it as an obstacle, as something standing between them and the outcome they need, a wall that appeared without warning in the middle of what had been a reasonably smooth interaction and now needs to be addressed, dismantled, argued away, or somehow navigated around before the conversation can continue toward its intended destination. And the instant they frame it that way, the instant resistance becomes an obstacle rather than information. Everything that follows gets harder, because the approach that obstacle framing produces is the one approach guaranteed to make resistance stronger rather than weaker. It produces counter-argument. It produces evidence marshaled against the objection. It produces a subtle but unmistakable shift in the energy of the conversation from collaborative to adversarial, a shift the other person feels immediately, even if neither party names it. And what was a single point of resistance quietly becomes a defended position. What was a concern becomes a conviction. What was a maybe no hardens under the pressure of being argued against into a definitive one. There is a completely different way to meet resistance, one that doesn't fight it, doesn't rout around it, doesn't perform patience while secretly waiting for an opening to dismantle it. One that treats resistance as exactly what it almost always actually is, not an obstacle standing between you and yes, but a doorway leading directly toward it. Here is the first thing to understand about resistance, the thing that changes everything once you genuinely absorb it. Resistance is not rejection, it is engagement. Think about what it means when someone goes completely quiet in response to what you've offered, when they neither push back nor engage, but simply disengage, give you the polite nod and the vacant smile and the "I'll think about it." That means they're already gone. That is the genuinely difficult outcome in a persuasive conversation, because there is nothing to work with. There is no energy in the room, no emotional investment, no point of contact between their world and yours. Resistance is the opposite of that. Resistance means the person is still in the conversation, still emotionally engaged, still processing what you've said against something real and important in their own experience. The pushback is happening precisely because something you said landed close enough to matter, close enough to encounter something they care about, something they're protecting, something that has weight in their inner world. That encounter, however uncomfortable it feels on the surface, is not a failed moment in the conversation. It is the most alive moment in the conversation, and the only question is whether you have the presence and the skill to meet it in a way that deepens the connection rather than breaking it. Chris Voss spent over 2 decades as the FBI's lead international hostage negotiator, operating in situations where resistance wasn't a professional inconvenience, but a matter of life and death. In his work, and in the research he's since contributed to the field of negotiation, one insight stands above almost everything else in its consistency and its power. The most effective response to resistance is not a counter-argument. It is an acknowledgement so accurate and so complete that the person on the other side of the resistance feels fully heard before a single word of rebuttal has been offered. Voss calls this technique tactical empathy. And the word tactical is important here, because it signals that this is not simply being nice, not simply performing sympathy, not simply nodding along while waiting for your turn to speak. It is the disciplined, strategic practice of demonstrating that you understand the other person's perspective with such precision and completeness that their need to defend that perspective, the energy that was fueling the resistance, begins to dissolve on its own. It sounds in practice like this. It makes complete sense that this feels risky to you, given everything you've already invested in the current approach. Or, of course, you're hesitant. Anyone who cares as much about getting this right as you clearly do would need more than what I've offered so far. Or simply, you're not wrong to push back on this. The concern you're raising is legitimate, and I want to address it properly. Notice what these responses are not doing. They are not conceding the argument. They are not agreeing that the resistance is correct or that your position is wrong. They're doing something more powerful than either of those things. They are removing the emotional fuel that was keeping the resistance alive. Because here's the neurological reality of what happens when someone feels genuinely understood in their objection. The amygdala, which had been generating the defensive response, begins to quiet. The threat signal that was keeping the person in a protected posture starts to soften. And in that softening, cognitive flexibility returns the ability to consider new information, to entertain alternative perspectives, to move from a defended position toward a genuinely open one. You didn't overcome the resistance. You dissolved the emotional infrastructure that was holding it in place. And that dissolution happened not because you were clever, but because you were genuinely, completely, unhurriedly present with the person's experience of the conversation. There is a specific structure that the most skilled negotiators, therapists, and persuaders use when resistance arrives, one that transforms pushback from a conversational crisis into the most productive sequence in the entire exchange. It moves through 4 distinct phases, each of which builds on the one before it. The first phase is full acknowledgement, not partial, not qualified, not followed immediately by a pivot. Complete acknowledgement of the resistance, named specifically enough that the person feels you understood not just the surface objection, but the concern underneath it, the fear beneath the objection, the value being protected. The past experience that makes this particular hesitation carry more weight than it might for someone else. The second phase is genuine curiosity, asking a question, not to gather ammunition for a counter-argument, but to understand the resistance more completely. Help me understand what specifically feels most uncertain about this, or what would need to be different for this to feel safer. Questions that invite the person to go deeper into their own objection, because going deeper almost always reveals that the surface objection was protecting something more specific and more addressable than the objection itself suggested. The third phase is bridging, finding the honest, genuine point of connection between what the person's resistance is protecting and what your position actually offers. Not manufacturing a false bridge, not performing agreement where none exists. Finding the real place where their concern and your solution are actually aligned, because in most cases of genuine resistance, that alignment exists. The resistance is often protecting exactly the outcome that your position was designed to produce. The person is just not yet able to see the connection because they're still in a defensive posture. And the fourth phase is collaborative reframing, inviting the person to consider their concern and your position together, not as opposing forces, but as complementary elements of the same larger picture. Not, despite your concern, here's why my idea works, but because of your concern, because you care about this thing enough to push back, here's why this particular approach actually serves exactly what you're trying to protect. When you move through those 4 phases with genuine care and genuine patience, when you resist every instinct to rush past the resistance and instead treat it as the most valuable moment in the conversation, something happens that no amount of argument ever produces. The person stops feeling like they're in a negotiation and starts feeling like they're in a collaboration, And a person who feels like your collaborator, rather than your opponent, is no longer looking for reasons to resist. They're looking for ways to move forward together. There is one specific pattern of resistance that deserves its own examination because it is the most common and the most mishandled in everyday persuasive conversations. It is the identity-based objection, the resistance that has nothing to do with the logical merits of what you're proposing and everything to do with who the person believes themselves to be. When someone says, "That's just not how I do things," or "I've never been the kind of person who," or "My team wouldn't go for something like this," they are not giving you an analytical assessment of your idea. They are protecting a self-concept, a story they've told themselves about who they are, how they operate, and what kinds of things belong inside the boundaries of their identity. This type of resistance cannot be addressed with evidence. You cannot out-argue someone's sense of self. Attempting to do so doesn't weaken the resistance, it transforms it from a preference into a principle, because now they're not just defending an opinion, they're defending themselves. The only approach that works with identity-based resistance is to find the version of your idea that lives inside their existing identity rather than outside it. To reframe what you're proposing not as something new and foreign, but as an expression of something they already believe about themselves at their best. This actually strikes me as very consistent with the way you've always approached, or the reason I thought of you for this is specifically because it requires exactly the kind of judgment you've demonstrated when, or people who care as much about quality as you do are actually the ones who tend to see the value in this kind of approach most clearly. You are not flattering them. You are genuinely helping them see that the thing you're proposing doesn't threaten their identity. It honors it. And a person who can say yes without surrendering their sense of self will say yes far more readily, far more completely, and with far less residual resentment than one who felt their identity had to be defeated for the agreement to happen. Here's the practice to carry forward from this chapter, and it requires genuine humility to implement it, because it runs directly against the instincts that most of us bring to high-stakes conversations. The next time resistance arrives, before you respond, before you formulate your counter, before you reach for your evidence, before you do anything, pause, take one breath, unhurried and complete, and ask yourself honestly, what is this person protecting right now? And do I understand it well enough to honor it? Not to agree with it, not to surrender your position, simply to understand it fully enough that when you speak, the person can feel in your words that you were genuinely with them, genuinely present in their experience before you ask them to consider yours. Because resistance met with that quality of presence doesn't harden, it softens, it opens. It reveals almost always that the person on the other side of the pushback wants exactly what you want. They just needed to know it was safe to want it in your presence before they could let themselves move toward it. Resistance is not the end of a persuasive conversation. Handled with presence and genuine care, it is almost always the beginning of the most meaningful part of it. Chapter 9. The Ethics of Influence. There is a question that lives underneath every conversation in this audiobook, one that we've circled around without landing directly on it until now. And it's time to land on it completely. The question is this: when does persuasion become manipulation? Where exactly is the line between influence that serves the person you're trying to move and influence that uses them? Between the kind of communication we've been building across these 9 chapters and something darker, something that wears the same clothes but operates from an entirely different intention? This question matters more than any technique in this audiobook, because here's the truth, that most persuasion training never gets honest about everything we've covered. Every insight about trust and emotion and questions and reading the room and handling resistance can be used in 2 completely different directions. It can be used to genuinely serve people, to help them make decisions that are actually good for them, to move them toward outcomes that honor both their needs and yours. Or it can be used to extract compliance from people who would not freely give it if they fully understood what was happening. The skills are identical. The techniques are the same. The only thing that separates persuasion from manipulation is something that exists entirely inside the person using these tools, something that no external observer can always see, something that no checklist can fully capture, something that lives in the honest answer to one question that every person who seeks to influence others must be willing to ask themselves with complete, unflinching honesty. Does this person's yes serve them, or does it only serve me? Let's be precise about what manipulation actually is, because the word gets used loosely, and that looseness makes it easier to avoid confronting the real thing. Manipulation is not simply using psychological understanding to communicate more effectively. Understanding how trust is built, how emotions drive decisions, how questions open minds. None of that is manipulation. That is competence. That is the same kind of understanding a skilled doctor uses when they communicate a diagnosis in a way that doesn't destroy hope, or a great teacher uses when they structure a lesson to match how a particular student's mind works. Competence in service of genuine care is not manipulation. It is the highest form of professional and human respect. Manipulation is something specific and distinct. It is the deliberate use of psychological influence to move someone toward a decision that serves your interests at the expense of theirs, while preventing them from clearly seeing that that is what is happening. It is influence that requires the other person's partial blindness to function. Influence that would immediately lose its power if the person could see the full picture of what was being done and why. That distinction, influence that would survive full transparency versus influence that requires concealment, is the clearest ethical test available for any persuasive act. Ask yourself honestly if this person could see everything, my full intention, my complete awareness of how this decision affects them versus how it affects me, every psychological mechanism I'm using, and why would they feel respected or used? Would they feel that I was genuinely trying to serve their interests, or that I was serving my own at their expense? If the answer is that full transparency would end the persuasion that the influence only works because the other person can't fully see it, then what you're doing is manipulation regardless of how skillfully it's dressed. Here's what makes this question so difficult for so many people in so many real situations. The line between persuasion and manipulation is not always clean. There are genuine gray areas, moments where your interests and theirs are partially aligned but not perfectly, moments where you believe something is good for them that they currently don't believe is good for themselves, moments where the short-term discomfort of being influenced towards something might genuinely serve their long-term well-being. A parent persuading a teenager to make a healthier choice, a doctor convincing a resistant patient to pursue treatment, a manager pushing a talented employee toward a stretch assignment the employee is afraid of but genuinely ready for. These situations involve real asymmetries of information, of perspective, of the ability to see beyond the immediate emotional response to the longer-term consequence, and in those asymmetries, persuasion that goes somewhat beyond what the person would immediately choose for themselves may be genuinely ethical and genuinely caring. But, and this is the critical distinction, the ethical version of these situations always involves transparency about the persuader's perspective and genuine respect for the other person's ultimate autonomy. The parent who says, "I understand you don't want to hear this right now, and I'm going to tell you what I see anyway because I love you, and your long-term well-being matters more to me than your immediate comfort," is operating from transparency and genuine care. The parent who uses guilt, shame, and emotional pressure to extract compliance while pretending it's the child's free choice is doing something fundamentally different, even if both parents believe they want the best for their child. Intention matters. But intention is not enough on its own. The most dangerous manipulators in human history believed, many of them genuinely, that what they were doing served a larger good. Belief in your own righteousness is not a sufficient ethical check on the methods you use to pursue it. What matters alongside intention is honesty about the method. Are you willing to be transparent about what you're doing and why? Could you describe your persuasive approach to the other person without destroying the relationship? If someone asked you directly, "Are you trying to influence me right now?" And if so, how? Could you answer honestly without the honest answer, dismantling everything you've built in the conversation? If yes, if your method survived transparency, then you are almost certainly on the ethical side of the line. And the confidence that comes from knowing that is itself one of the most powerful things you can bring into any persuasive conversation. Now let's talk about something that most discussions of persuasion ethics leave out entirely: the long-term strategic reality that makes ethical influence not just morally right, but practically superior to manipulation in every measurable way. Manipulation works once. Ethical persuasion compounds. Think about the most trusted person in any organization, any community, any family system you've been part of. The person who, when they speak, people actually listen, whose influence seems effortless, not because they're the loudest or the most aggressive or the most strategically clever, but because years of consistent, honest, genuinely caring interaction have built something that no amount of tactical cleverness can manufacture. That something is reputation. And reputation specifically, the reputation of being someone who never uses their influence against the people they're influencing, is the most durable and most powerful persuasive asset that exists in human social life. Every time you use psychological understanding to genuinely serve someone, every time you make your ask in a way that honors their autonomy and their intelligence and their right to say no, you make a deposit into that reputational account. The trust deepens. The relationship strengthens, and the next conversation becomes easier, not because you've gotten better at tactics, but because the person across from you has accumulated enough positive experiences of your influence to approach the new conversation already oriented toward yes. Every time you manipulate, every time you extract a yes through pressure or deception, or the exploitation of psychological vulnerability, you make a withdrawal. Sometimes a small one that isn't immediately noticed. Sometimes a catastrophic one that ends the relationship on the spot. But always a withdrawal. Always a reduction in the trust that is the only real foundation of durable influence. The manipulator wins the transaction. The ethical persuader wins the relationship, and over any meaningful stretch of time, over a career, over a life, over any sustained engagement with other human beings, the relationship is worth infinitely more than the transaction. There is a framework worth carrying into every significant persuasive conversation, not as a checklist to perform, but as a genuine orientation to practice until it becomes instinctive. Before you try to move someone, ask yourself 3 questions with complete honesty. First, do I genuinely believe that what I'm asking this person to do is in their interest as well as mine? Not just defensible as being in their interest, not just arguably neutral, genuinely beneficial. If the answer is yes, if you can honestly say that what you want them to do is good for them, then you have a solid ethical foundation to stand on, and you can use every tool of effective communication with complete integrity. If the answer is no, if the honest assessment is that what you want serves you at real cost to them, then the ethical path is not to find a cleverer way to persuade. It is to either renegotiate what you're asking for, find a way to make the proposition genuinely mutual, or honestly acknowledge the asymmetry and let the person decide with full information. Second M, am I respecting this person's genuine right to say no? Not performing respect for their autonomy while engineering the conversation to make no feel impossible. Genuinely, actually, leaving real space for them to decline, and being prepared to receive that decline without punishing it, without withdrawing warmth, without making them pay a social or relational price for exercising the freedom you claim to be offering. Because here is one of the most important ethical realities in all of influence. A yes that was obtained by making no feel too dangerous or too costly to give is not a free yes. It is compliance wearing the clothes of agreement, and building your relationships, your career, and your reputation on that kind of compliance is building on sand. Third, would I be comfortable if this person could see exactly what I'm doing and why? Not comfortable in a defensive way, not comfortable because you've constructed a justification you could defend under pressure. Comfortable in the way that genuine integrity produces. Comfort, the deep, quiet ease of knowing that your actions are aligned with your values, that you are the same person in the persuasive conversation that you are when no one is watching, that you would not need to edit or explain or reframe what you're doing if it suddenly became fully visible. That alignment between who you are in persuasive moments and who you are in every other moment is not just an ethical ideal. It is the practical foundation of the kind of influence that lasts. Here is the deepest truth about ethical persuasion, the one that brings everything in this chapter and everything in this audiobook together into a single complete idea. The most sustainably powerful persuaders in the world are not the most strategic. They are not the most psychologically sophisticated. They are not the ones who have studied the most research or mastered the most techniques. They are the ones who have genuinely, deeply, without reservation committed to the well-being of the people they're trying to move, who bring to every persuasive conversation the same fundamental orientation: I want something good for both of us. I believe it exists, and I am going to work with everything I have to help us both find our way to it. That orientation, not as a strategy, but as a genuine expression of character, produces a quality of presence that cannot be faked, cannot be manufactured, and cannot be approximated by any amount of tactical cleverness. It produces the kind of trust that opens people fully, the kind of connection that makes yes feel not like a concession, but like a choice, freely and gladly made. And it produces, over time, the kind of reputation that turns influence from something you have to work for in every individual conversation into something that precedes you, a living record of every time you chose integrity over short-term gain, every time you left someone feeling better for having been influenced by you, every time you made a yes that served them both instead of just yourself. That is the foundation. Everything in this audiobook was always pointing toward, not techniques, not tactics, character. The deep, consistent, tested under pressure character of someone who has decided as a matter of principle, rather than convenience, that the only influence worth having is influence that the people you're influencing would thank you for. Chapter 10. Becoming someone people always want to say yes to. You made it here. Not just to the final chapter of this audiobook, but to a place inside yourself that is genuinely different from where you were when we started. You may not have the full language for what has shifted yet. That's completely normal. The deepest changes rarely announce themselves loudly. They settle quietly into the architecture of how you see, how you listen, how you move through conversations, and you only fully realize they've happened when you catch yourself responding to a difficult moment in a way that the person you were before this would not have known how to find. But before we close, before we name the full scope of what you've built across these chapters, there is something important to address directly, something that sits between understanding these ideas and actually living them. Because understanding is not transformation, and that gap between knowing and being is where most personal development ends without ever becoming what it promised. Think about every insight you've ever had that didn't change anything. You've had them. Everyone has. The moment of genuine clarity, the book that cracked something open, the conversation that reorganized your thinking, the realization that arrived with a felt certainty of something true, and then the slow drift back toward the old patterns. Not because you stopped believing what you understood, but because understanding without practice is like a map without legs. It shows you where you could go. It cannot take you there. The single most important thing you can do with everything in this audiobook is not remember it. It is not review it. It is not recommend it to people you think need to hear it. It is to use it imperfectly, inconsistently, sometimes badly in real conversations with real people starting in the next 24 hours. Because the only way any of this moves from something you know intellectually into something you carry in your body, something that operates in you automatically in high-stakes moments when you don't have time to think is through repeated, deliberate, honest practice in the actual conditions where it matters. Let's talk about what that practice actually looks like and what it will ask of you. The first thing it will ask is patience with yourself as a learner. Every skill that ultimately becomes effortless first goes through a stage where it is effortful and awkward and feels less natural than the old habit it's replacing. The first time you resist the impulse to argue against resistance and instead acknowledge it fully, it will feel strange. The first time you ask a question and sit in the silence rather than filling it, the silence will feel uncomfortably long, even when it's only 10 seconds. The first time you deliberately pace before you lead, reflecting back someone's reality, before introducing your own perspective part of you, will be impatient to get to the point. These moments of awkwardness are not signs that you're doing it wrong. They are the exact sensation of a new neural pathway forming the biological reality of a pattern being learned at the level where it will eventually become automatic. Every master communicator you have ever encountered, every person whose presence and persuasive ability seemed natural and effortless, went through this exact stage of awkward, deliberate practice before the skill became part of who they are, rather than something they were consciously doing. Your job is not to be perfect. Your job is to be consistent. To keep returning to the principles even after the conversations where you forgot them entirely. To treat every interaction, including the ones that don't go the way you hoped, as practice, rather than performance. The second thing this practice will ask of you is something deeper and more personal than any technique in this audiobook. It will ask you to genuinely care about the people you're trying to influence, not as a strategy, not as a technique for building rapport that then enables persuasion, as an actual lived commitment to the well-being of the human being sitting across from you, their interests, their fears, their aspirations, their right to make decisions that belong truly to them. This sounds obvious, but it is, in practice, one of the hardest things to sustain consistently, especially in high-stakes moments when your own needs are pressing, when the outcome matters enormously to you, when the pressure to get the yes is at its most intense. Because it is precisely in those high-pressure moments that the temptation is greatest to slide from genuine care into strategic performance of care, to go through the motions of listening without actually receiving, to acknowledge someone's resistance while internally waiting for the opening to dismantle it, to ask questions as set up rather than as genuine inquiry. And people feel that slide. They feel it in ways they can't always articulate, a subtle shift in the quality of the attention, a barely perceptible change in the felt safety of the conversation. And when they feel it, the very thing you needed most, their openness, their trust, their genuine willingness to be moved quietly, withdraws. The protection against this is not more technique. It is genuine, repeatedly renewed, consciously cultivated investment in the actual person in front of you. Before every significant conversation, return to the question we introduced in Chapter 6. Not what do you want from this person, but what do you genuinely want for them? Let that question settle until it produces a real answer, and carry that answer into the conversation as the ground everything else stands on. Now let's name what has actually been built across these chapters, because the full architecture of it, seen together, is more complete than any individual piece suggested. We began by dismantling the most damaging myth about persuasion, the idea that better arguments produce more agreement. We established that the human mind is not designed to be convinced but to be protected, and that the entire approach of pushing harder against resistance produces more of exactly the resistance you're trying to overcome. We built the foundation of trust, the invisible architecture that either opens people to your influence or closes them before you've said a meaningful word. We learned that trust is not built through competence demonstrated, but through safety felt, and that safety is communicated through presence, through non-judgmental listening, through the willingness to be uncertain in the service of being honest. We discovered the language of agreement, the specific words, structures, and silences that orient people toward yes before you've made your ask. We learned the difference between but that erases and that builds. We understood pacing and leading people in their current reality before inviting them toward a new one. We learned that silence, honored rather than filled, is often the most persuasive thing in a conversation. We went deep into the emotional reality of every decision, the neuroscience that confirms, beyond debate, that logic presents the case, but emotion makes the choice. We learned to lead with genuine acknowledgement of what is already being felt before introducing anything we want someone to think. We understood that the journey from pain to possibility traveled honestly, without manufacture or exaggeration, is the most natural path to the kind of yes that holds. We explore the art of questions, how a precisely constructed, genuinely curious question does more persuasive work than any statement because it generates insight from inside the other person rather than delivering it from outside. We learn to ask and then honor the silence, to find the yes that already exists within the resistance, to let people become the advocates for their own movement. We built the confidence that doesn't push the grounded, non-attached, internally anchored certainty that comes not from needing to be right, but from genuinely caring about the outcome for the other person. We learned that performed confidence signals anxiety, while genuine confidence signals safety, and that safety is the condition in which all real agreement becomes possible. We developed the capacity to read what rooms are actually communicating, the deeper stream of nonverbal truth running beneath the surface of every conversation. We learned to see micro-expressions, read vocal tonality, interpret the architecture of silence, and use what we perceive not to gain advantage, but to respond to what is actually happening rather than what is being presented. We learned to meet resistance as a doorway, rather than an obstacle, to acknowledge it so completely and so precisely that the emotional infrastructure holding it in place begins to dissolve on its own. We understood identity-based resistance and how to reframe what we're offering as an expression of who the person already is, rather than a challenge to it. And we built the ethical foundation that all of this stands on: the commitment to influence that would survive full transparency, that serves the people being influenced rather than using them, that compounds into reputation rather than eroding into it. That is what you have built. That is the complete architecture of the communicator you are becoming. But here is what I want you to really feel as we close: not just understand, but actually feel. The person who carries all of this into their daily life is not just more persuasive, they are more human, more present, more genuinely connected to the people around them, more capable of the kinds of conversations that actually change things, not just transactions completed and agreements extracted, but real moments of human contact where two people met each other fully and something new became possible that wasn't possible before. This is what persuasion at its highest level actually is. Not a set of tools for getting what you want, a complete orientation toward other people, one that makes you someone whose presence creates safety, whose questions create insight, whose care creates trust, and whose influence, therefore, feels not like pressure applied from outside, but like clarity arrived at from within. Think about the person in your life right now who most needs you to show up this way. The conversation you've been avoiding because you didn't know how to have it without it turning into a fight. The relationship where something important has gone unsaid because the risk of saying it felt too high. The situation at work where you know something needs to change, but every attempt to move it has produced more resistance than progress. That situation, whatever it is, looks different now than it did before this audiobook began. Not because the situation has changed, because you have. You see it differently. You understand what has been generating the resistance. You know what you haven't been doing that you now know how to do. And you have, for the first time, a genuine sense that the conversation you need to have is not the obstacle between you and the outcome you need. It is the path to it. Go have that conversation. Not perfectly, not with every principle from this audiobook executing flawlessly in real time, just more presently, more curiously, more honestly than you would have before today. Because here's the final truth, that this entire audiobook has been building toward the one that I want to be the last thing you carry out of this experience and into your life. The people who consistently get yes, who move through their careers, their relationships, and their highest stakes moments with a quality of influence that seems almost effortless, are not doing something that you are fundamentally incapable of. They are not born with something you weren't given. They are not operating from some secret psychology that exists outside of what we've covered together across these 10 chapters. They simply decided at some point, in some conversation, that probably didn't go the way they hoped to stop trying to win and start trying to connect, to stop performing certainty and start offering presence, to stop pushing for yes and start creating the conditions in which yes becomes the natural, freely chosen, genuinely felt response of a person who trusts you completely. That decision is available to you right now, not someday when you've practiced enough, not eventually when you feel ready. Right now, in the next conversation you have with another human being who deserves your full presence and your genuine care. Make the decision. Keep making it. In every conversation with every person across every high-stakes moment where the outcome matters and the temptation to push is at its strongest. Keep choosing presence over pressure, connection over argument, and genuine care over the need to be right. Do that consistently. Do that with the full architecture of understanding you've built today behind every interaction, and watch what becomes possible in your life when the people around you stop feeling managed by you and start feeling genuinely met by you. Because a person who feels genuinely met by you doesn't just say yes once. They become someone who looks for reasons to say yes to you again and again and again for as long as you keep showing up the way you showed up in that first conversation where they felt, perhaps for the first time in a long time, that someone was truly, completely, unhurriedly there. That is the transformation. That is what this was always about. And it doesn't end here. It starts here.